Have you ever been dragged into the spotlight just to be mocked? Inside a lavish wedding hall, a powerful man invited his ex-wife only to humiliate her. "You don't belong here." Every eye turned to Angela. Instead of breaking down, she gripped the frayed edge of her silk scarf and lifted her head with steady resolve. That moment sparked a fight for justice. What would you do when faced with such cruelty? The violin sang through the grand wedding hall, its notes rising under glittering chandeliers. Crystal glasses shimmered with red wine as guests in elegant gowns and tuxedos laughed and waited for the grand announcement of Richard Hale's wedding. Richard, the powerful man with a smile that always radiated confidence. The air was thick with expensive perfume, mingling with the scent of white roses draped across the banquet tables. Yet in the middle of all that splendor, one corner of the room fell silent when every eye turned toward a woman. Angela Brooks sat quietly at her table, her hands resting on a white silk scarf frayed at the edges. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back neatly. Her face was calm, but her eyes held an unshakable resolve. Across the aisle, a woman in red held up a golden wedding invitation, the embossed letters shining, "Angela Brooks, front row." Laughter rippled from the following table, sharp as a blade. "His ex-wife got an invite?" "What a joke," one voice rang out. The crowd stirred with curiosity, their mocking glances slicing straight at Angela. She set down her silver spoon. The soft chime of metal against porcelain was enough to center her again. Raising her head, she met their stares, her voice low but firm. "I didn't come to be mocked. I came to witness the truth." The words dropped like a stone into a still pond, freezing the air. A few coughed, others whispered louder. "Thrown out for being barren, and she dares to sit here? Shameless." Angela's fingers traced the silk scarf, feeling its worn threads, as if reaching back to the old kitchen where she once cooked family dinners. The same kitchen where Richard once promised her a home that would last forever. Richard entered then, tall and imposing in a gleaming black suit, striding like royalty. His eyes swept the room and locked on Angela. His lips curled into a taunting smile. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying through the microphone. "Today is a special day, and I'm glad everyone is here, even those who belong to the past." A brittle laugh broke out from the corner, echoing his mockery, but Angela didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her eyes steady and clear. "If you think I came here to cry, you're wrong," she said softly, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Everyone waited to see what she would do next. Beyond the tall glass windows, the evening sun scattered flecks of gold across the wooden floor, painting what looked like a path of escape. A waiter passed with a silver tray, its reflection catching Angela's straight shoulders, and her hand gripping the scarf tight. Inside her, a spark flickered, small but enough to remind her. She was no longer the trembling woman who once walked out of her home with nothing but a cloth bag, a few dresses, and unspeakable pain. The host's voice rang out, urging the guests to take their seats as the ceremony was about to begin. Angela rose, the silk scarf still in hand, and strolled toward the front row, the very seat Richard had chosen to make her humiliation complete. Every step echoed with whispers and sneers from the crowd, but her spine stayed straight, her eyes fixed firmly on the stage where a new chapter was about to unfold. What would you do if you were shamed before the world? Angela stood in the front row, her hand brushing the polished wood of the chair. The hall seemed to hold its breath. A woman in a green dress whispered loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "Why sit there? Wasn't she left because she couldn't have children?" The words spread like smoke from a kitchen fire, drawing glances from every corner. Angela drew a long breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of her silk scarf. Memories surged back, steam rising from a pot of soup, the worn wooden table, the small kitchen where she once waited for the family she longed for. Richard saw the shift and pressed harder. His leather shoes tapped the floor as his voice rang out. "I placed her in the front row so everyone can see the difference. Some women kept a house empty for 7 years. Others know how to make a family bloom." Laughter and murmurs rippled through the crowd. They waited for Angela to collapse. She didn't. She lifted her eyes, steady and unflinching. The scarf clenched in her hand was her answer, as if to say, "I've never forgotten who I am." Then from the back, An older man with silver hair spoke. He was a longtime customer at the small diner Angela opened after the divorce. She once gave me a hot bowl of soup when I didn't have a dime. A woman like that doesn't deserve to be shamed. The hall stirred uneasily. Some eyes softened, but Richard sneered and stepped closer. Kindness doesn't bring children. A barren woman is still just an empty shell. The cruel words cut the air like a cold wind. Angela trembled, then slowly sat down, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the stage, as if daring the silence itself. Her silk scarf slipped to the floor, spread flat like a memory left behind. She bent to pick it up, smoothed the creases, and steadied her breath. Outside the tall windows, the sky had darkened, but a final streak of sunlight broke through, landing on her fragile shoulders. Amid the whispers, Angela sat quietly, calm in a way that unsettled the room. But in her eyes, something waited, an untold truth, ready to rise. Would justice come in time to restore Angela's dignity? Angela sat tall, the scarf smoothed in her hands, though her fingers still trembled. A guest rose, voice half mocking, half pitying. She's only here to remind us of failure. Laughter flickered, chairs scraped lightly in agreement. Angela didn't reply. She lifted her face instead, letting the last light of day touch her eyes. For a moment, she saw the little kitchen of years past, where her mother's old copper pot once hung, a bitter memory of waiting that never ended. Richard stepped forward, gripping the microphone, his voice booming through the hall. This is the contrast. On one side, a new home. On the other hand, barren ground. I want everyone to remember scattered applause broke out, tangled with murmurs. Angela pressed her lips together, the scarf tight in her hand, her eyes unwavering. Just as she prepared to speak, a woman cut in sharply. Stop it, Angela. Don't make this party more uncomfortable. Accept it. The words wrapped around her throat like a tightening rope, the air heavy with silence. Then unexpectedly, a young man spoke. He had once been her student in a community cooking class. His face flushed red, but his voice was firm. No one knows how many lives she helped rebuild. This woman is no failure. A few glances shifted in the crowd, curiosity softening the mockery. Richard scowled, his words clipped and cruel. Enough. Nobody needs those small stories. The truth is plain. She couldn't give children. The hall froze, waiting for Angela's response. She rose, laying the silk scarf on the chair, her hands unshielded at last. Every eye followed her as she spoke slowly, each word sharp as a needle piercing the air. No one has the right to strip me of my dignity. But Richard cut her off, his hand raised, his eyes cold as stone. Sit down. This isn't the place for you to justify yourself. Angela paused. Her lips trembled, but her gaze stayed bright, unwavering. The atmosphere stretched tight, like a string ready to snap. The scarf lay still on the chair, its deep fold etched like a scar of time. Angela drew a breath, her back straight, her eyes sweeping over the crowded hall where accusations still lingered. She hadn't yet spoken the truth she carried, but her eyes had already planted its seed. And the hall waited, hushed and tense, to see if she could break through the wall of humiliation. Was the truth strong enough to shatter the shell of lies Richard had built? The wedding hall fell silent. Golden light from the chandeliers cast Angela's shadow across the polished wooden floor. She stood near the front row, clutching her frayed silk scarf, the deep folds etched with years of endurance. Guests in glittering gowns and suits watched closely, their eyes a mix of curiosity and scorn. Whispers drifted like cold wind. What else is she going to do? Richard strode forward, his leather shoes striking the floor, his gaze sharp as glass. Gripping the microphone, he spoke with arrogant pride. Angela, you should know your place. Sitting there, watching my new happiness, is more than enough. Laughter erupted from one corner, stoking the fire inside her. Then an older woman, one of Richard's business associates, rose abruptly. Her voice was sharp. We came to offer blessings, not to hear her excuse her failures. The words cut like a blade, drawing nods from some, cold chuckles from others. The room thickened with tension, heavy as the air before a storm. Angela moved a step toward the stage, but two security guards appeared, blocking her path. The light glinted off the buttons of their uniforms, cold and unyielding, like an invisible wall. She froze, her hand brushing the scarf. Memories crashing back. An old test report in the drawer of her rented home. The doctor's words stating she was perfectly healthy. But that proof wasn't here. All she had was the scarf and her pride, now under fire. In that moment, a young man's voice rose from the back. Nervous but steady, he called out, "Miss Angela has proof. Let her speak." The crowd stirred. Some faces shifted from ridicule to curiosity. It was her former student from the community cooking class, the boy she once helped when his family struggled. Richard spun around, his eyes blazing. "Enough! This is my wedding day. No one disrupts it." His voice cracked with fury, but the sweat on his brow betrayed unease. Angela drew a deep breath, her chest rising, her hands tight on the scarf. She lifted her head, her voice trembling yet clear. "One day the truth will come to light. No one can bury it forever." Her words pierced the air like a needle. A few people faltered. Others whispered louder. Is she just making excuses? Yet some eyes wavered, doubt creeping into the story Richard had crafted. The silk scarf slipped from her hands, tumbling to the floor, curling under the dim golden light. She bent to pick it up, then paused midway, her hand hovering, as if holding on to the faintest spark of hope. Outside the tall windows, twilight deepened. A single streak of fading sunlight rested on her thin shoulders. The hall tightened like a drawn string, the crowd's murmurs mixing with the pounding of Angela's heart. Despair pressed down, yet the fire of truth smoldered inside her, unextinguished. The entire hall held its breath, waiting to see if she would rise further, or be drowned by scorn. Angela stood tall, her eyes shining toward the stage where Richard loomed, her stance declaring she was no longer the silent woman who once endured in shadows. Would the truth be buried on the very day she was meant to be broken? Angela froze, her hand hovering over the silk scarf draped across the chair. The murmurs around the hall sliced at her ears like tiny blades. She felt unbearably small, like the night she once trudged through pouring rain, clutching a torn cloth bag. That shadow returned in her mind, squeezing her chest tight. Shame spread through her body, yet her shoulders stayed straight. She refused to bow. Richard turned away, his arrogant smile unmistakable. The crowd shifted, some turning to idle chatter, others shaking their heads with thin laughter. Angela sat down, placing the scarf across her lap, smoothing each crease with trembling hands. In her memory, she heard her mother's voice in that old kitchen. "Never forget, you still have worth." Tears blurred her vision, but those words kept her from breaking. Suddenly, an elderly guest rose and fixed his gaze on Richard. "Are you certain you know the whole truth?" The hall fell silent. Richard scowled, brushing it aside. "This isn't the time for that." The older man sat down again, but his question planted a seed of doubt among the guests. Angela clutched the scarf, and for the first time that night, her eyes flickered with a fragile light, hope that not everyone had turned away. The host's voice broke in, urging the guests to settle so the ceremony could continue. Time felt like it was closing in, each second a narrowing window. Angela rose again, taking a deep breath. She tied the scarf into a small knot, a quiet vow not to retreat. Looking straight toward the wedding stage, her voice trembled, but carried clearly. "I will not let the truth be buried." The hall fell still, every eye turned. Richard gripped the microphone, ready to silence her, but Angela had already stepped into the aisle. The spotlight caught her, stretching her shadow long across the polished floor. In that tense silence, a strange calm filled her. Even at her lowest point, her pride in the truth stood as her anchor. Would that fragile hope be strong enough to turn everything around? Angela stepped into the aisle, the knotted scarf in her hand like a cord keeping her upright. The hall was silent, broken only by the sound of her shoes against the polished floor. Richard scowled, lifting the microphone, his voice cutting cold. "What more do you want? This is my wedding day, not your stage." Angela stopped, her gaze locked on him. Her voice was low but steady. "I came to speak the truth." The crowd stirred, some surprised, others forcing uneasy laughter. From her small purse, Angela pulled out a paper worn with age, its edges frayed, its color yellowed. Her hand trembled, but the words were still clear. Completely healthy. She raised it, her voice breaking yet firm. This is the result I've kept for 7 years. The problem was never me. The room fell silent. Guests looked at one another, whispering. Richard hurried down, pressing the microphone close, his tone sharp. Old papers proved nothing. Who knows where you even got that? Sweat dotted his forehead, his words harsher with every breath. Angela held the paper tighter, her eyes steady on him. You never once tested yourself. You only needed someone to blame. From the back, a woman's voice rose. Then let a doctor speak. Murmurs rippled into a wave of tension. Angela folded the paper, pressing it against her palm, her eyes lit by the golden glow above. The image recalled the day she first walked out of that cold house, carrying only a cloth bag with a few dresses in this very test result. But today she wasn't leaving quietly. She stood tall, demanding justice. Richard faltered, yet still barked, Sit down. No one here believes you. Angela didn't retreat. She took another step forward, raising the paper high, her voice ringing through the hall. If needed, I'll let everyone see it with their own eyes. I have nothing left to fear. The hall erupted. Whispers rose into loud discussions. A few guests stood, their eyes fixed on her, waiting. In that moment, everything paused, as if the entire room held its breath, waiting for someone to open the door to truth, finally. Would this act change everything? Golden light from the chandelier spilled across the wedding hall, making the worn test paper in Angela's hand glimmer like living proof. She raised it high, her voice trembling yet firm. The results from years ago, normal reproductive health, no abnormalities. A middle-aged guest in the center row stood, took the paper, and read aloud. Confirmed, no issues detected. The hall erupted, gasps and whispers spreading like fire. Richard snatched the microphone, sweat beading on his forehead. His tone was sharp but shaky. What does an old paper prove? Who knows where she even got it? Some nodded in agreement, but many eyes wavered, now fixed on Angela with new curiosity. She stood tall, gaze locked on him, her voice slow but cutting. You never tested yourself, Richard. For 7 years, you only needed me to blame. Her words pierced the stifling air, drawing a few startled exclamations. Is that true? A young woman in a shimmering blue dress rose from the back, her voice unsteady. If she's right, then he's the one avoiding the truth. Murmurs swelled into a rising tide. Heads nodded. Eyes shifted toward Richard, heavy with doubt. He stepped forward, forcing composure, though the hand gripping the mic trembled. Don't let her ruin this day. This is nothing but a ploy for attention. But his voice cracked, stripped of its former force. Then a doctor among the guests spoke up, the very man who once worked at Angela's old clinic. I remember this result. If needed, I can confirm its validity right now. The hall tightened like a string about to snap. Richard forced a smile, lifted a glass of wine from the nearest table, and stammered. Everyone, this is a wedding. Don't let one piece of paper spoil it. But Angela pressed on. She opened her purse again, pulling out a second note, the edges curled, the ink faded to pale blue. It was the doctor's handwritten statement from years ago. Patient Angela Brooks, no reproductive issues. She handed it to an older guest nearby, her voice steady. This is the second proof. I haven't lied. The hall exploded. Whispers turned into a heated debate. One man shouted, if she's telling the truth, then who's really at fault? Richard stumbled back, his eyes darting, the mic buzzing with static in his shaking hand. He stammered, This is a lie. She just wants to ruin everything. But no laughter followed. Every gaze fell on Angela, standing firm, her hands still gripping the knotted silk scarf. The sight etched itself into the room's silence, a living symbol of truth breaking through. Outside, twilight had surrendered to night, but the chandeliers burned bright, casting Angela in the glow. Her thin shoulders didn't waver. Guests began to rise, some stepping closer, their eyes filled with respect and wonder. Richard turned away, his hand falling. The microphone slipped. hitting the table with a hollow crack, and in that instant, the hall doors swung open. A figure appeared, sending shock waves through the crowd. Whispers surged. The room held its breath, waiting for the final turn of truth. Would the truth triumph at last, or be silenced one more time? The wedding hall doors burst open, the latch clattering in the heavy silence. A middle-aged man in a white coat stepped inside, carrying a thin folder with its corners worn by time. Murmurs rippled through the guests as some recognized him. Dr. Huang, who had once worked at St. Mary's Clinic, where Angela's test had been done 7 years earlier. He walked forward, his voice calm but cutting. "I'm the one who signed Angela Brooks' results. These records are still kept at the hospital. She was completely healthy, with no reproductive issues." His words sliced through the silence, shaking the entire hall. Richard froze, his face draining of color. The wine glass slipped from his hand, crashing against the tablecloth, red spilling across white linen. The crowd erupted in whispers, eyes shifting from Angela to Richard. A businessman in the front row sighed, his voice heavy. "We've trusted the wrong man for too long." Angela clutched the knotted silk scarf, her eyes wet but her back straight. She gave the doctor a slight nod, simple yet full of gratitude, like a burden of 7 years had finally lifted. A single clap rose from the back of the hall, then another, until applause spread like a wave, echoing loudly. Guests stood, some nodding in respect, others bowing their heads in shame. An elderly woman in a plain violet dress stepped forward, took Angela's hand and whispered, trembling, "You've endured too much. Now everyone knows the truth." Angela smiled, soft, warm, and helped steady the woman. Golden light washed over them both, like firelight warming a winter night. Richard stumbled backward, panic in his eyes as he searched for escape. The voices grew louder. "He's been hiding all along. He blamed her to cover himself." Each word cut away at the false image he'd built. He tripped against a table, the microphone slipping from his shaking hand, landing with a hollow thud, a sound like defeat. The wedding, meant to be his stage, had become the backdrop for his downfall. His bride stood motionless at the corner of the stage, her grip tightening on the bouquet, her eyes full of doubt. Angela returned to her chair, laying the scarf across her lap, smoothing each fold as though closing the pages of a painful chapter. No tears fell, only calm spreading through her gaze. A few guests stepped forward, offering handshakes, eager to share in the dignity just restored. A young woman whispered, "You're so strong. I wish I dared to stand up like you." Angela nodded, her eyes bright, as though rediscovering herself after years of being buried. Outside the tall windows, night had fallen, but the hall's lights still glowed brightly, illuminating Angela's figure, small yet unshaken. She rose and strolled down the aisle. Each step felt lighter, as though the weight she carried had lifted at last. The crowd watched, some raising their phones to capture the moment, determined to preserve the image of a woman who had won through truth. The applause carried on, not just for Angela, but for justice itself, justice now burning bright. Would that light spread beyond these walls? Angela sat back down, the silk scarf smoothed across her lap. The applause slowly faded, leaving only its echo, steady as a heartbeat. Her gaze moved calmly around the room, no longer avoiding, but at peace. She smiled softly, a smile light as breath, yet strong enough for others to see the power just reborn. In that moment, the weight of years seemed to slip from her shoulders. As the crowd stepped back, a guest picked up the worn paper Angela had shown. He set it gently on the table, the yellowed page standing as a witness to a life unjustly judged. Angela glanced at it, her eyes softening. She remembered the night she left her home empty-handed, carrying only a few dresses and that very paper. Today it was no longer a burden, but proof that restored her dignity. Outside the tall windows the sun had dipped low, its pale gold spilling across the rippling river. Angela strolled down the aisle, her hands reaching out to clasp those of others along the way. An elderly woman whispered, "You've won, but with truth, not with noise." Angela nodded, her eyes bright, her heart at rest. In that smile everyone understood. Some battles are won simply by standing firm. She paused at the doorway, turning back once more. Her steady eyes and upright posture carried the weight of her journey, from humiliation to vindication. Silence filled the room, and in it they saw one truth. The truth never dies. Angela stepped outside, her smile lingering. The truth will always find the light. What would you do in the face of injustice, knowing you hold the truth? As the wedding hall settled into silence, Angela gently smoothed the frayed edge of her silk scarf, her eyes calm with quiet peace. The yellowed paper, once a bitter burden, now lay still, a witness to truth restored. Beyond the tall windows, golden light spilled across the river, recalling the long journey she once walked with trembling shoulders. But today, the soft smile on her lips had become her strength, quiet, steady, and proud. The truth will always find the light. What would you do in the face of injustice, knowing you hold the truth?